College football nerds here to do a rapid fire discussion, basically a reaction on some of the bowl matchups that came out, obviously the playoff matchups that came out as well. We're going to do bowl previews throughout the bowl season, so this isn't it from us. We just want to get a quick hitter out there and discuss this because there's not any games to really preview this week. So keep an eye out for the bowl preview discussions. This is more of a general topic discussion. We also put out a quick-ish, probably a little longer talk regarding basically our view on how we would re-rank the playoff committee's top 10. So keep an eye out for that one this week as well. One pitch on a pet project of mine. That's a lot of P's. TheSnapCount.com. It is basically a college football satire website. I think it's hilarious. You may not. I'll show you all some examples of some articles that we have put out. If you love it, if you love what you're seeing so far, go check it out, thesnapcount.com. Remember, that's not on YouTube, so you're not going to get a lot of drive from us on that. So you'd have to like Facebook, like Twitter to keep up with those. So do it. Help me out a lot. Thanks, y'all, on that. All right, Josh, let's talk playoffs first real quickly. I thought the committee got it right in seeding. Doesn't necessarily mean that's how we would rank them top 10. But for me, I said earlier on Saturday, I think for Oklahoma, who I felt would get in, if the 1 and 2 shifted, LSU is a far worse matchup for Oklahoma than maybe Ohio State is. Doesn't mean Ohio State is worse than LSU, just in terms of the matchups and style of play, strengths and weaknesses. I think LSU is a far worse matchup for Oklahoma than Ohio State would have been. Give me your initial thoughts on this one.
I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think Ohio State's really power offense and the better defense would have given Oklahoma potentially some fits. I could see Oklahoma moving the ball in LSU. They've had issues throughout the season in just playing sound assignment football against teams that are really good about, just getting the ball out in space. It's what gave them fits against Florida. It's what gave them fits at times against Alabama. Oklahoma's going to be able to do that. And I think Ohio State's a little more sound defensively. And I'm not sure they're necessarily more talented. That's a whole different discussion. We've talked about it all year. LSU has talent. It just hasn't shown up. So I think that allows Oklahoma to move the ball a little better. But that said, LSU's offense and the way they're able to distribute the ball may give Oklahoma real fits. And we talked about this in our bowl preview actually really briefly, but I think there's maybe a mistaken assumption that Oklahoma plays in the Big 12. Therefore, they've played better offenses. That's not really true this year. LSU is a much better offense than anyone Oklahoma's played. The top-ranked offense that Oklahoma played was Texas. Texas is not on LSU's level. They played really close early in the season. I still kind of chalk that up personally to Texas playing out of their mind more than anything, especially given the fact that Texas couldn't beat some bad teams later in the year. Not good teams, but bad ones. I think it's a more close matchup than maybe some people are anticipating, at least personally.
The next one, I saw a tweet from our favorite Bill C saying that Ohio State fans might be frustrated with dropping down a slot, but just in terms of overall feel, he said aesthetics, and I think it has merit. In terms of overall feel, LSU-Oklahoma is a great matchup, and Ohio State-Clemson is a great matchup, and better than swapping those. And I feel the same. Clemson-Ohio State, I think that Ohio State fans feel a little bit disrespected by moving down a slot, which is great because Clemson has felt disrespected all year. My initial thoughts on this game are I think we'll see a better Ohio State, obviously, than we saw against Wisconsin because they'll get healthier and they won't be on their third straight good opponent. My concern is we still don't know a whole lot about Clemson, but we know that they are seemingly peaking right now, which has happened a couple years in a row. I have concerns about Ohio State in this game in terms of how they match up against Clemson, if Clemson is who we think they are. But there's also the thought of maybe Clemson has just been killing bad teams. What do you think?
Ohio State had a lot of struggles with Cephas at Wisconsin. And what they're going to face with Clemson is sort of a team full of Cephases, right? I mean, Higgins and Ross are that kind of guy at a higher level. They have a running back in ETN that's different than Taylor, but not necessarily worse. and certainly as explosive. Everything that Wisconsin did well, Clemson's going to be able to do better. And everything, it's kind of actually interesting to me when you look at Clemson and Wisconsin. They're kind of built a lot of ways in similar ways, but Clemson is a lot more talented in the end result. They're a lot more talented, I'll say, in the front. Clemson's front is freaky athletic. It's probably the most under radar thing I think all year, just how good and deep they are in their front. Mostly because it never actually really got tested. I think you can throw on Clemson potentially if you can block them. I'm not sure Ohio State is the team to do that because the way their offense is designed. It's an interesting and challenging matchup. I think this was the matchup Ohio State did not want. I think they had a better matchup with LSU and Oklahoma, and the real reason is they are a run-first offense, and they are a zone read offense, and they're playing the best team that is equipped to stop that zone read offense. And they're also playing the team that is really the least reliant on the run and the most able to throw to big-body receivers downfield. I think this is the worst matchup that Ohio State could have drawn out of the top four.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean we think Ohio State isn't number one. It just means matchup-wise, it varies drastically from team to team. I will say that this is on both sides of the ball by far the best team Clemson will have thought about playing this year. It's not even close. Some of the other high profile games, obviously Minnesota, Auburn, and Alabama, Michigan are standing out to me. And we don't know, caveat, we don't know who's going to sit out for the game. There might be some people sitting out, and it might change the calculus on this a little bit. But I think there's an opportunity if both sets of teams show up with mostly intact for a narrative on 2019 to be drawn fairly for who was the stronger conference, who had the better record, or who the stronger strength of schedule with Auburn, Minnesota, Alabama, Michigan. It's a little unfair, and I want you to touch on this, that Penn State drew Memphis. I'll say I think it's unfair because I don't think we get an opportunity to really see who Penn State was this season. But you have a little bit of a different angle. I want you to talk about that.
Every year, people get all bent out of shape about the bowl records of a given conference. And I think what people usually miss is that bowl records of a conference usually just indicate whether you were slotted high or slotted low relative to the teams you were put up against, right? And usually the team that gets, or the conference that gets a team, I should say, against the G5 slot struggles a little bit in the bowl season, or at least takes a hit for it. And the reason is, if you get that team in that G5 slot, that means you have 3 teams in the New Year 6. Everybody else gets slotted down. So this year, you end up with an Auburn slot that is much higher ranked than Minnesota, and Alabama that's higher ranked than Michigan, and an Oregon that's higher ranked than Wisconsin. The Big Ten is at a disadvantage in every one of those slots. So I think on one hand, and we've talked about this a lot, it's really hard to evaluate that clump of really SEC teams, the like 2 through 5, the clump of 2 through 5 Big Ten. And it's going to be an interesting barometer to see Alabama, Michigan, Auburn, Minnesota. But I also think you kind of have to keep in mind, properly, it would be Alabama, Penn State, and Auburn, Michigan. They're both being slotted kind of one team up, at least in the pecking order in the Big Ten. That negatively affects things. So I say, Penn State or Wisconsin, one of the two against Alabama. So that does sort of skew things a little bit, but I definitely think it's interesting.
And this is why I say don't necessarily look at bowl records, look at individual matchups. If Michigan goes out and beats Alabama or gives Alabama all they want, that might tell us something. If Minnesota beats Auburn or gives Auburn all they want, that might tell us something. Even if Minnesota doesn't win, it might tell us a lot. So I agree that the slotting matters, and we've said this is similar to when 2 SEC teams, or because it's only been SEC so far, but any conference, if they got 2 teams in the playoffs, everybody, it hurts because instead of the second best team playing in the Sugar Bowl against Big 12 number 2, You've got the third best team playing against Big 12 number 2, and I'm saying this because SEC might even be Big 12 number 1, depending on who did or did not get in. The 2017 year, the SEC got 2 in the playoffs and drew the G5 in the next one down, which is crazy.
I do think it's interesting that stylistically you get like Auburn, that's the super powerful, super talented team that doesn't play up to their level, and then Minnesota, who's supposed to be the scrappy team that's not very talented, playing against them. And then you have Alabama and Michigan and sort of the, battle between ultra talented teams on both sides that maybe didn't quite live up to standards. I think there's really interesting storylines in those bowl games.
Yeah, I think there are, and we're going to preview all these games, but I do think it was worth noting sort of the draws, because there for a while, the draw was maybe Alabama, Virginia Tech, which I didn't want to see because we would learn nothing about the SEC this year. Like you said, Alabama right now, you said this in our other video, Alabama is kind of the pivot point for the SEC in terms of relative strength because a lot of these other teams have played them. Florida drew Virginia. I think that's a weird matchup. Not great, not fun, not super interesting. Georgia Baylor, you kind of screwed us on this one because on Twitter, in the middle of the SEC championship game, you said Baylor wouldn't score on Georgia, and I don't think you meant that like they would score 0 points, but I think you meant, and I'll give you a chance to defend yourself, I think you meant that they would have a really tough time scoring. Do you want to maybe dig us out of a little bit of a hole before this game actually happens, since now it's gone from hypothetical to actual?
I did genuinely mean, of course, that not that Baylor would absolutely be shut out of the game, but that Baylor would have a hard time scoring more than, say, 20 points in the game. Baylor is a good enough team probably to put up points against Georgia. I do think Georgia and Baylor is an interesting matchup. And again, I think Auburn, Minnesota, and Georgia, Baylor are kind of under the radar for really good litmus tests. Alabama, Michigan, everybody expects Alabama to beat Michigan. And if Michigan just plays that game close, it's going to be considered a win. But Georgia, Baylor, Baylor, for them to justify their ranking, really has to play Georgia really tight. And if Georgia is able to handle Baylor, that's going to be extremely telling or damning or however you want to put it. And I think, I don't know the common perception. I know after that LSU Georgia game, a lot of people are really low on Georgia. And interestingly, in the metrics, I don't think that's the case at all. That's going to be a real litmus test for, metrics and, quality in terms of SEC fans versus a lot of national perception and people that are more down on Georgia. How much of that really is due to the quality of play in the SEC and the quality of play in the Big 12? It's definitely a litmus test game, just as much as the Texas-Georgia game was last year.
Another one that I think is pretty interesting that just kind of caught my eye, because we talked in the other video about how it's unfair sometimes where we say you don't have any ranked wins or you have so few ranked wins. Right now, Notre Dame is paired with Iowa State. I actually, if I'm picking that game, I might pick Iowa State. I don't think it's a great matchup for Notre Dame. But we're talking about a 15th ranked Notre Dame and an Iowa State team that Oklahoma, I think, fairly gets criticized for playing really close, but still would have had another ranked win. So these two teams are playing each other in a bowl, which tells you really they're kind of similar level. I know there's some issues with how you slot Notre Dame given their independent, status, but we think these two teams are kind of on the same level, but you've got number 15 versus unranked. I think that's crazy, especially when I think that Iowa State might beat Notre Dame. Any quick thoughts about that?
Well, S&P Plus, which these rankings predate the conference championships, but Notre Dame was 18, Iowa State was 23. In advanced metrics, these teams are not very far apart. Notre Dame is a little bit better, but maybe like a field goal better than Iowa State. I do agree with you. And I think a similar game is Utah and Texas, which I find fascinating that those two are going to play each other in the Alamo Bowl.
Yeah, it's funny. I saw Utah fans being frustrated. They thought they were going to get passed up. And because last year I think USC got the Alamo and they got sent to the Holiday, and the reverse happened this year. I think Utah's a better team than they're given credit for, given that they didn't beat a ranked team all year. We've talked about that, but also that the way did not show up versus Oregon. I think they're a decent team. So that is an interesting matchup. Another one where either we are going to be just absolutely having to eat crow or not. Texas A&M and Oklahoma State. We've said all year that it's kind of unfair that A&M can't be ranked because they can't beat. You can't be ranked 25th because you were unable to beat. I'm going to do it off the top of my head. I think they played 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 12. And we're saying, hey, App State, you can beat South Carolina by 5 points and beat a bunch of crappy G5 teams. We're going to rank you. Texas A&M, if you want to be ranked in the top 25, just beat number 3 on the road or just beat number 1. Just do one of those things, and then we'll put you in the top 25. So we've said A&M is a better team than their ranking has shown. Well, they're playing a ranked team. And this is probably where Oklahoma, I think they should have a ranked win in Iowa State and maybe shouldn't have a ranked win in Oklahoma State. The problem is I think Oklahoma State is actually a bad matchup for Texas A&M. And A&M might end up losing this game, and we'll be eating some crow. Tell me, does this game provide an opportunity for us to – is it going to be real good or real bad for us?
I think it's going to be real good or real bad. I mean, it's either going to show that Texas A&M belongs in the game with Oklahoma State, which, I mean, they've been in the game with a lot of these top teams and just never could win them. Outside LSU and Alabama, they were one-score losses and all the rest of them. Clemson too. But yeah, Oklahoma State, I don't think it's bad that they're ranked. I think it's a little weird because without the starting quarterback, that Oklahoma win really loses a lot of the luster, even though it was a decent win in how they performed. I think another one that's kind of odd or interesting is USC versus Iowa. I've talked all year about the fact that Iowa was kind of the linchpin for the Big Ten, that so much hinged on Iowa being a legitimate like top 18 team because it's the only ranked win for some teams. And, maybe we'd be able to see something from that. And then what we get on the other side is USC and a USC team that barely scrapes into the rankings and didn't really do much of anything this season. I was kind of hoping for a better result, but at least this keeps Utah from him. And maybe it's a better matchup for Utah to play Texas instead of Iowa. I'm not sure.
For me, I think these are the ones that really jump out. And there are some others, one being App State versus UAB. UAB isn't a team that anybody thinks should be ranked. We'll see how they play each other in the bowl game. I actually think UAB might win that game, partially because I'm a huge Bill Clark fan. Any other games that jump out to you that you wanted to touch on?
I think one is Tennessee, Indiana in the Gator Bowl. I think that's kind of an interesting one for two teams that were often viewed as a decent win for respective conferences, and then were laughed at by everybody in the other conference, right? Big Ten fans thought it was something to beat Indiana. SEC fans thought it was something to beat Tennessee soundly. Nobody else really cared. Even though they're at the bottom end of it, I think that's kind of an interesting one. Washington, Boise State. I think that one is also really interesting because it sort of establishes, to our point, how much should these G5 teams really have been ranked? Because Washington was a team that's really flirted with being ranked all throughout the year. And Boise State, I think, needs to win that game. I mean, Boise State needs to win that game to show that they were actually a top 20 team versus Washington. And that's, I think, kind of true throughout the G5. They need to really show up and prove themselves in this bowl season.
And I'll echo the point you said before. People love to tout bowl records. We're not big on that. I think there's two things that I kind of care about in bowl season. It's matchups and margins of victory. If two teams are off slotted, that's okay. We'll see how they play against one another. I don't care because the final bowl record doesn't matter to me, because a lot of times you might have your lower end teams rack up a bunch of wins and your upper end teams not. Or you might have a conference that doesn't send a team to the playoffs, so you're slotted up for everybody. Like Pac-12 number 1 is now playing, in my mind, Big Ten number 3. So let's look at the individual matchups and not just run to Twitter and say, oh, the SEC was 8-1 in bowl games, blah blah blah. It might be because they just had favorable matchups. Let's look at the actual games, and the one that I always use is last year. I'm gonna drag Texas A&M across the being decent finish line. Last year, Texas A&M was SEC number 6 or 7. They played ACC number 2 in NC State, who was a 9-game winner last year, and they beat them like 52-12. And to me, that point went completely unnoticed because Texas A&M, nobody cared about Texas A&M in the year, but it was a good kind of, as you said, it's a litmus test, and that's why I love bowl matchups. I just hope everybody shows up, and this whole sitting out for a bowl game becomes passe, because I like bowls just as much as the playoffs. I think it's a fun watch, and I actually love that they're on. I work from home, and I can have them on in the background, some of the early ones. So, all right, y'all, that's our quick-ish discussion about the bowl matchups. Remember, these are not our previews. We will do previews for all the big ones. We'll kind of sprinkle that content out throughout the course of December and a little bit in January, obviously. Remember, to get notifications on those, you need to hit the notification bell, not just subscribe. Keep an eye out for us, and you can always hit us up on Twitter at CFB Nerds. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.